This is the G2 refrigeration system recharging procedure. To perform the procedure, you'll need gloves and eye protection, a refrigerant manifold gauge set with low pressure gauge and valve in blue, and high pressure gauge and valve in red, and a utility port and hoses to attach everything. You'll need a small bottle of R134A refrigerant with at least 150 grams of refrigerant. And you'll need a Pierce can valve and a hose with 1/4 inch flare connectors. You'll also need a scale with a maximum capacity of 1 to 2 kilograms and an accuracy of 1 or 2 grams. You'll also need the G2 unit that needs servicing with the outer cover and top and front panels removed. And lastly, you'll need a PC with software to control the compressor. The first thing we'll do is go to the electronics behind the front panel and unplug 2 connectors: the compressor speed control and the cooling solenoid relay. We unplug the solenoid relay to remove the heat load from the system while we're filling it. And we unplug the speed control to keep the compressor at idle so that it doesn't add any more heat to the system. Now we'll attach our gauge set. First, we make sure that both of the valves are closed. And then we'll attach the low pressure gauge to the low pressure port. It might vent a little bit. Wipe off any oil that might escape when it vents. And now it's reading the pressure of the valve. And now we'll attach the high pressure hose to the high pressure port. And it will probably vent as well. Make sure the hoses are attached tightly, but don't torque them too hard. At this point, we'd like you to take a picture of the gauges and send it to us. This will help us determine if it is in fact undercharged and by how much. When turned off and stabilized at room temperature, the high pressure side should be between 75 and 100 psi. If it is over 100, then it is overcharged. If it is below 75 psi, then it is probably undercharged. Now, with our gauges attached, we'll connect our PC to the COM1 port on the G2 unit. Connect the power cord and hook up a distilled water supply to the distilled water in port. Then we'll open an RS-232 communications program on the PC and turn the G2 unit on. We should see some initialization messages scroll by. You'll also hear some pumps, fans, solenoids, and other motors initialize. Once the G2 unit is fully initialized, we'll check the saturator temp by typing TS question mark. Then we'll check the saturator temperature set point by typing TS set question mark. If the saturator temperature set point isn't a few degrees below the current saturator temperature, then we will change it with the TS set equals command. So we type TS set equals 20 or whatever value is right below the current saturator temperature. Once that is set, we issue the run equals 1 command to start the compressor. After issuing the command, there should be a several second delay, and then the compressor should click on. Now that the G2 is running, we'll prepare the refrigerant. First, we'll attach the Pierce can valve to our can of refrigerant. The Pierce can valve has a needle which will pierce the top of the can the first time that the valve is closed. So to start, we open the valve all of the way to retract the needle into the body of the valve. Then we'll screw the valve onto the can. And depending on the type of threads on the can, it can require quite a bit of force to attach the valve completely. Once the valve body is completely seated, close the valve quickly. This will pierce the top of the can and close the valve simultaneously. Once the can is pierced, the valve should not be removed until the can is completely empty. Now attach the hose that will go from the can to the utility port on the gauge set. Now weigh the entire setup of the can, valve, and hose. This can and valve assembly weighs 564 grams. We'll weigh it again after we've added refrigerant to the system to see exactly how much we've added to the system. This way we can avoid overcharging, which can damage the compressor. Now that we've attached the valve, hose, and connector to the can and weighed the assembly, we'll attach the can to the gauge set at the utility port. Don't tighten the flare coupling completely. First, open the valve on the can just a little bit until refrigerant starts leaking from the flare coupling, then tighten the flare coupling until it is completely tight. This purges most of the air out of the line. Now, open the can valve completely, and then very slowly open the low pressure valve, not letting the low pressure gauge go above 30 psi. Now watch the high pressure gauge and shut off the low pressure valve when the high pressure gauge reaches 100 psi, or if it stops increasing, whichever comes first. Now close the can valve. Open the low pressure valve slowly again. Wait until the low pressure gauge goes down and stops. Then close the low pressure valve again. Now unhook the refrigerant from the utility port on the gauge set and weigh the assembly again. Now weigh the bottle and hose assembly again and record the difference from the first measurement. This difference is how much R134A we've added to the system. If you remember, our first measurement was 564 grams, and our second measurement was 446 grams. This indicates that we've added 118 grams to the system, which is less than the maximum of 125 grams. Let the compressor run for 10 to 15 minutes, keeping an eye on the gauges. If the high pressure gauge goes above 130 psi, or after 10 to 15 minutes, turn the compressor off with the run equals 0 command. Let the G2 sit and stabilize for 2 to 3 hours. The low pressure and high pressure sides should start to equalize. Turn the unit off, then go back to the front panel electronics and plug in the speed control and the cooling solenoid relay. The G2 should be ready to be turned on and evaluated. It could take between 10 and 20 minutes before the cooling system begins to function normally. Once the system is functioning, turn it off, remove the gauge set, and put caps on the Schrader valves. Replace the front and top panel and outer housing.